I admit I have a crutch. No, I'm kidding. I had a question for you guys. Have you ever noticed that there just seems to be a warning label for just about everything? And for things that don't really need to be warned about, there are warning labels that like totally make sense, and then there are others that make you go, huh, I wonder why they had to put that warning label on that, right? So, for example, the warning on Tide pads used to wash your clothes, Tide pods, Tide pads. Wake up, Brant, need more coffee. The warning on Tide pods, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, it's used to wash your clothes, but then this like crazy trend happened, and so they're like, yeah, don't eat it. That's not a good idea. So, harmful if swallowed. You know what I mean? This is a no-brainer, but apparently it wasn't. So someone had to put a warning label on it. Here's another warning label. I saw this one recently. I wasn't at the horse ranch, but I saw that somebody was at a horse ranch, and it said this, warning, horses may bite and kick and fart. And it just kind of got me thinking, I think that we can all agree that, horses probably aren't exactly the most, how do I say this? I was going to say friendly, I was going to say, they're kind of flatulent sometimes, right? They need some space. Don't stand behind a horse is what I'm trying to say. You would think that would be, but at some point somebody was just like, okay, I knew that horses pooped, I knew that horses kicked, but why didn't you tell me that a horse farts? And then they probably sued the horse ranch, and so the horse ranch is like, I guess we have to put up a sign that says, warning, our horses fart. So you would think that some would make sense. It's a living being, it has bodily functions. But then on the other hand of the common sense spectrum, on the other side, you have warnings that kind of go just beyond crazy. So like, I saw this one on a wheelbarrow. It said, wheelbarrow not intended for highway use, which apparently happened, and so they had to put a warning label. Okay, question, who would totally do that? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. Or this one, I hope none of you do this one, but they had to put this warning label on a baby stroller. It was actually, this is on the back of a baby stroller user manual. Remove child before folding it. Okay? So yeah, don't kill your child that way. Or how about this one? This is on Apple's website when the iPod Shuffle came out. Do not eat the iPod Shuffle. It kind of reminds me of like those fun dip sticks, you know? Yeah. Or finally, okay, this one you guys are going to feel this one, I'm sorry. This is a warning. This next warning was on the back of an electric drill. Okay, here's what it says. This product is not intended for use as a dental drill or in medical applications. That's too desperate of a measure. I'm just saying. Man, we got warnings for everything in life. And these examples are pretty funny and seem sort of useless. I mean, do people really need to be told not to eat an iPod Shuffle? I mean, apparently they do. You do?
No.
Oh.
At my work, they just added a sign like outside next to the big like trash dumpster.
Yeah.
And it said like, please don't make sure you're not in the trash thing when they're compacting it.
Oh, stay out of the dumpster when they're compacting the trash. Oh no.
They just added that.
Someone got stuck in one. Oh no. That's a bad day. That's a bad day. Ay, ay, ay. Now, I say all this because we don't just see warning signs all the time in life, right? We can see them, we can hear them, and sometimes we're like, oh yeah, duh. And other times you're like, I wonder why that. But let's be honest, if at some level, if you've grown up in church, maybe you've had this experience that you've heard warnings and warning labels against all kinds of different activities, right? There used to be warnings at the college that I went to against dancing because it could eventually lead to having children. And so that was kind of a weird warning. And we're like, maybe not. So we would plan choreographed bodily movements overturn that. You can actually dance that Moody, but it used to be there was warnings against certain things in Christianity. Maybe you've grown up and feeling this like, wow, why is that something I can't do? Why is that something I can't do? But all of these warnings are trying to prevent us from making bad choices. And all these bad choices boil down to one word that all of these warnings are trying to keep us away from. And it's that word sin. Right? And the word immediately kind of has a negative vibe. No joke. I literally was uploading a video to YouTube this last week, and I was putting in a bunch of tags that key search word would pick up and that kind of stuff. And YouTube told me, you're going to have a detrimental success as far as search engine optimization if you use the tag sin. Like, sin has this negative connotation that makes people want to go, ooh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't have anything to do with that. And so whether you've been coming to church as long as you remember, or you just recently started following Jesus, we're all familiar with this general idea of sin, right? We know that sin is this bad thing. We shouldn't do it, or if we do it and cross the line. But after that, we kind of stop the conversation about sin. We don't really keep going that much further. But here's the interesting thing about our view of sin. Whether it's sin as a whole or specific types of sins. You know, whether someone says, I was born in sin, or like we're sinners as a whole, or whether it's like that's a sin, we all generally tend to apply those kinds of sins to a scale, right? I think a lot of us have something like this in our head. Right? We've got this sin scale. And we spell it in red. Just kidding. Right? We've got this sin scale, and it's like things that we can do that are like, okay, maybe? To totally not okay. Right? We would generally put different sins on a scale somewhere in this range. So whether we're talking about murder, we're like, yeah, we get that that's totally not okay. So we would give that maybe a 10 out of 10. But then there's like, okay, but what if I'm lying to protect somebody from getting hurt and it's a white lie? Right? Like, what if I, so we might throw a white lie, whatever that even is, right? I think we all get the concept of what I'm trying to talk about. Like, we might throw a white lie or something on the okay question mark side of it, maybe a 0.5 on the scale. What about stealing for somebody? Maybe for us, like stealing, especially if it's a bad person, that might mark up here around a 7 or something like that. Right? Maybe for instance, we have other sins that may not be just that bad. They might be semi-justifiable. If somebody asks you how they look, and in your head, your first word is like, but you can't say that. You can't respond that way, so you're like, you look great. Right? It might be a white lie. And you're like, that's not as bad as murder, is it? I don't think that's as bad as murder. Or especially not if you want to stay friends with that person. I'm trying to witness to them, Jesus. Or, for example, what about cheating? Right? You copied on someone on literally your last science test. And if you get a good grade on this, you're going to make that final nice GPA slot, which is going to give you admittance into that nice good school, which will finally give you a good career. And you're like, but if I blow this test, it might blow all of that out of the water. And so maybe I might put like cheating on a test like a 2 or a 1.5. Or maybe you like threw some big time shade at someone, but it was like behind their back, it wasn't to their face. And so it was just like you and those group of friends. And you kind of gossiped about them, but you're like, you said no offense right beforehand, so it didn't really count, right? And so maybe you throw that as like a 3. Why do we say that anyways? No offense. You're like, yeah, offense is coming. I know it's coming. No one says no offense and then says something nice afterwards. It's true. But here's my point. We all understand that certain things are wrong. But when something falls a little bit lower on the sin scale, we tend to downgrade its importance, which leaves us wondering, are some sins more important than others? Or are some sins really such a bad thing? Like, what if it's on this side of the scale? Is it really that bad? Like, even Christians put sin on a scale at times, which can leave us feeling confused when some sins seem worse than others. You know, murder, cheating, white lie, gossiping behind someone's back but saying no offense, right? Like, what's the real story here then? What's the deal with this idea of sin? What's actually happening? What's the real story? And week 1 we learned that Jesus wants all of us to be free, right? A few weeks ago we talked about that. Jesus set us free for the sake of freedom. And that means that we no longer have to do the work to overcome all of this to make ourselves right with God, because Jesus already did that. So if this is already kind of taken care of, then are these kinds of things really that big of a deal? If you're a Jesus follower, what's the deal with sin? Really, like, in actual practical life, what's the actual deal? And I think to answer these questions, I want to go back to the book of Galatians, which we've been looking at for the last few weeks. So go ahead and turn with me in your Bible to Galatians chapter 6. Right? In quick recap, Galatians is not actually a book, right? It's a letter to a group of Jesus followers. It's actually modern day Turkey is where Galatia used to be. And at some point in history, when Paul wrote this, Christianity was a very new thing. So you have a bunch of people who are joining churches now, and they've never followed Jesus before. In fact, they've never been religious before. But they're joining churches filled with people who used to be Jews, who grew up on this very strict religious system of all these do's and don't do's and haves and have-nots and rules and rules to safeguard their rules. And so these new Jesus followers are joining these churches, and now there's almost this culture clash. People who grew up with cultural religion, people who grew up not knowing anything about God. And so some of the people in the church are going, well, you have to do all of these things that we've always had to do to stay within our religious identity. Right? You've got to fast on the Sabbath. You've got to do all that. You can't work on the Sabbath. You have to be circumcised if you're a guy, to which some of the guys are like, really? Do we have to do that? Right? You know, and at some level, there was this pushback. There was this tension of like, what do we have to do and what do we not have to do? Sounds like a variation kind of our question on sin, right? Like, what's okay and what's not okay? At what level is this really affecting me? Where's the line? Like, what's the sin scale? On the sin scale, what are the important ones that I have to avoid? And what are the ones that I don't really have to worry about? And so Paul wrote this passage that we're about to read in response to this question. Okay? And I like the way he says it in the New Living Translation, so I'm just going to read it from here. Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 7, you will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. Next slide. And those who live to please the Spirit, however, will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let's not get tired of doing what's good. And at just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Now, it's important to understand the cultural context in which Paul wrote this. I mentioned a little bit about this. But also, when you and I go to the grocery store to buy coffee or any other sort of product, usually the product of harvesting for us is grabbing off the shelf and giving over some green stuff, right? We get it, we pay for it, we bring it home, we brew it or we cook it, right? But in this cultural society, there's no such thing as Walmart or Target or Family Fare. Like, they didn't have this, obviously. I'm not teaching you guys anything new. But it's important to realize that for them, harvest meant you had to plant. Let's just take a wheat seed, okay? This is a wheat seed, and you would just plant these all over the place. My brother-in-law, he's a farmer up in North Dakota, and every once in a while they plant wheat, and I think that's what they're doing this year. And so you plant wheat early on in the season, and then you hope there's a lot of rain, right? And then you put sunlight on it, you put in exposure to sunlight, you till the ground, you water it, you remove all of the weeds, you put some stuff to help it grow, and then at the end of the season, after a long time of waiting for stuff to happen under the ground, this is what happens in August. This is called harvest, yeah. And if you're a huge farm like theirs is, you have like tons and tons of these. And my brother-in-law actually lost his, I forget which finger, his pointer finger on one of his hands just recently because he got caught in one of those. So he went down to grab something out in the combine and popped his finger right off. So he has a bionic finger now. It's really cool. But what happens is when you plant the seed, it doesn't immediately go on the shelf. Right? There's a process of waiting until the harvest happens. So when Paul compares outcomes to planting and harvesting, his audience understood exactly what he's saying. Essentially, he's saying your choices now are like these seeds. They're going to determine what you eventually harvest. To give you another example, does anybody know what you have to plant in order to get a coffee tree? Anybody? Ani, you know? Yeah, so coffee, if you go to the next slide here, you can't really see it, but this is a little coffee plant. I guess they're just transplanting this right now, but go to the next slide. When you harvest a coffee bean, it doesn't come out as a brown little bean. It comes out as cherries. And if you want to grow more, the pit of that cherry, you're going to plant. All right? That's a coffee tree. Yep, those are coffee cherries. And so what will happen is when you plant a coffee cherry pit, up comes a coffee cherry tree, but it comes months and months later. It's only in specific climates. But the thing is, if you plant a regular cherry, like a maraschino cherry, you're not going to get a coffee tree, right? You have to plant a coffee cherry pit in order to get a coffee. In other words, what you plant is going to determine months later or years later what you eventually harvest. So you plant this coffee pit or coffee cherry pit, eventually it turns into this coffee tree. You harvest the cherries, you take the fruit off the cherry, and you roast the pit, which is eventually what becomes a coffee bean. And then you grind the coffee bean and you brew the coffee bean, and you know, Pastor Brant is happy after that. But don't miss the point that Paul's trying to make. What you plant is going to determine what you harvest. You're not going to plant corn and get wheat. You're not going to plant eggplant and get coffee trees. Thank the Lord. You're not going to plant carrot seeds and get potatoes. What you plant, you're eventually going to harvest. In other words, what Paul is trying to say is your decisions and your actions now will eventually bear fruit. It may not happen next year. It may not happen in 3 years. But every choice, every action is planting seeds for your future. Paul's saying, if you want a harvest, what you planted, what do you want that harvest to look like? And that's the question that is posed to each one of you right now. If you're eventually going to harvest what you're planting now, what do you want that harvest to look like? Because you actually get a say in that. Instead of providing this simple list of what to do and what not to do, Paul actually tells the Galatians this. And we'll look at verse 8 here. It's the next slide. He says, those who live only to satisfy their sinful nature. In other words, you do things. no matter where they are at on the sin scale, if you do things only to satisfy your sinful nature, what does it say you're going to harvest? You're going to harvest decay and death. That's strong language. That's like gets to the heart of it, literally. But Paul's saying that bad choices are going to lead to bad outcomes. That's just how life works. So maybe you don't consider gossip to be this major sin, right? But you continually plant gossip. And then you're going to eventually get the results of gossip, which is decay in your friendships. Guess who doesn't want to hang out with someone who gossips about them? All of you. So guess who's going to stop hanging out with people who gossip about them? Gossip is eventually going to lead to decay. You're going to reap the fruit of gossip. Or maybe you continually choose not to study and to cheat and hoping you're going to pass certain classes. Guess what you're going to reap? A terrible foundation for success in college or whatever you do after high school. Maybe you don't go to college. Maybe you go into a trade. And instead of following the manual by the book, you cut some corners and then somebody dies because something you did was not structurally safe because you planted the seeds of cheating in high school. Right? What you plant now, you're eventually going to reap. Maybe you continually tell lies. Guess what you're going to reap? Not being trusted in the future. If you continually sin in how you treat your body's not going to last long. If you continue to plant the seeds of using drugs or alcohol or sexual activity to cope with things, you may just harvest addiction or an inability to deal with life. What you plant now, you're going to harvest later. At the end of the day, Paul knew that if you're following Jesus, you're going to experience life. But if you continue to plant things that are going to hurt you, you're eventually going to get hurt. This whole idea of avoiding sin is not God trying to limit you. He's not trying to withhold life from you. In fact, he's trying to withhold you from the negative consequences that you could potentially be sowing into your future. God is trying to give you the best path possible. So there's good news here, because if you're planting good decisions, what Paul says is you're going to reap a harvest of life. What you plant, you're going to harvest. Paul isn't just talking about good decisions harvesting happiness. Okay? Happiness is going to come, it's going to go. Happiness is kind of based on your circumstances, and sometimes I'm happy and sometimes I'm not. Paul's not he's talking about something bigger than this. He's talking about harvesting the things that Jesus was offering, things like joy, things like peace or rest or abundant living. I think this is kind of what he meant when Jesus said this. John chapter 10, verse 10. It's one of my favorite passages, and I love what he says about his purpose of coming to life. Jesus says, my purpose is to give them a rich and a satisfying life. Other translations say, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly, or have it to the full. Right? Abundance of peace. More than enough peace. Abundance of joy. More joy than you expected. You're surprised by the amount of joy. More abundance of satisfaction, more than you would have hoped for. Abundance means abounding beyond the necessary quota. Abundance of life. It's just brimming out of you. That's what the Lord is holding out before you. So if we kind of get stuck in this idea of what do I avoid, what do I not avoid, just to make sure I'm okay, Paul's saying you're missing it. There's life, there's joy, there's peace, there's satisfaction, there's abundance available. Live to the Spirit. Don't live for the sinful nature. Don't just think about how much you can avoid to gratify your own flesh but still be cool with God. And he's saying, I came to give you so much more than that. What you plant now, you're going to harvest later. Do you want to harvest an abundance of trust that people have in you? Then plant the truth now. Do you want to harvest amazing, life-giving friendships? Then plant seeds of integrity and honesty now, in generosity. Do you want to be a good husband or wife someday? Then plant the seeds of treating your dating partners or even your friends with respect and honor now, of self-giving instead of self-receiving, self-gratifying. That's going to reap a harvest of an amazing marriage someday. Do you want to be good with money? Do you want to make sure that you continually grow in the abundance of what God has given you? Then plant seeds of discipline and wisdom now. Why? To be right with God? No! Jesus already took care of that. This is no longer a concern for us. We don't plant these seeds just to avoid the edge. Jesus took care of that already. We follow God's instructions for our lives now because free people know that their now affects their later. Okay, if I could say anything succinctly and powerfully and let you remember this for the rest of the night, this is the thing. Free people who live with the freedom that Jesus provides, free people know that their now affects their later. The abundance of harvest that they're excited about harvesting later, they're planting right now. Free people do that. Following Jesus is not about keeping score or weighing out our sin. It's about freedom. It's about life. Jesus wants you to experience abundance in the life that he's given you. Jesus wants a full harvest of a good life. You don't start harvest with harvesting, guys. You start harvest with planting. That's why Paul wanted the Galatians to know that no matter what you plant, there is going to be a harvest. Every action, every thought, everything that you plant, everything that you do, everything that you say is a seed you're planting. Plant freedom now, harvest freedom later. Right? Plant discipline now, harvest wisdom later. Plant honesty now, harvest trust later. Let's go back to our original conversation about sin. Jesus wants us to be free. Jesus said straight up, that's why I came. I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. Who the Son sets free is free indeed. For freedom I have set you free. He's already set us free from the ultimate cost of sin. The consequence of sin. And that's separation from God, right? But here's the thing. We can still harvest the consequences of sin now. Jesus took care of the ultimate penalty of sin. But there are still things that we do in the course of this life that run their course, that we eventually harvest from actions and words and things we did previously. And Jesus wants freedom. He doesn't want you dragging around the negative consequences that you're harvesting from things you used to do. If we plant poor choices, we're going to harvest poor outcomes. That's God's universal principle in life. Nobody's exempt from that. I used to sit here and read stuff like this and go, I can beat that. Or I can beat the system. This is a universal thing in life. When we're careful in what we're sowing now, we're clearing the way to experience a harvest of freedom, a future free from painful consequences, a future free from regret, really. I can tell you story after story in my own life of terrible choices that I planted and negative outcomes I experienced. I can also tell you a number of different stories of good choices I planted, things that nobody noticed. Frankly, sometimes when I plant good seeds, don't we want a crowd when people plant good seeds in their life? Like, hey, I studied an extra hour for history. Hey, I showed up early to practice. Right? Like, hey, I didn't say a thing back to you. I could have lied, but I didn't because I was honest. I hope you noticed the good seeds I'm planting. Sometimes that's the thing that holds us back from planting those good seeds. The harvest that we plant, no matter who's watching, we are going to, the seeds that we plant, no matter who's watching, we are going to harvest eventually. People watching, awesome. Sometimes the Lord gives you an audience and raises you up in front of people. Other times He doesn't, and He lets you sow in silence for years. And then all of a sudden, someday, the fruit that you produce, you're like, everyone's like, where did that come from? It came from the secret place when I was still sowing good seeds, no matter who was watching. Think back on some of your big decisions or actions that you've taken in the past. And I bet those choices harvested one of two responses. Either, I'm glad I did, or, I wish I had. Question. What choices are you making today that will put you in that first category? I'm glad I did. Or maybe on the flip side, what are things that you're involved in or things that you're still trying to shake or things that you're doing that you're like, I bet that's going to land me in that second category? Sin always comes with a warning label. God didn't put those labels there to scare you. God had given us an instruction manual to limit us. He didn't give us all these warning labels just to micromanage our lives. I hope you get that, guys. That following Jesus is so much bigger than religion. That this is not about just do it or don't do it. Like, God didn't give us these warning labels just to limit us. No, He put those there so that you could experience more freedom. The kind of freedom that comes with making choices that make your today good and your tomorrow great. That's what this is for. To help you experience life and help you experience it abundantly, more than you even possibly can understand how much you need. Guys, we were made to be free. And I want to close with this. We were made to be free. And God wants us to be free from sin and from the consequences it brings us. He doesn't want us to miss out on that better future. He wants us to miss out on something else. He wants us to miss out on the pain and the separation that it creates, that sin creates. That's what Jesus is hoping you miss out on. And the only way to avoid a bad harvest later is by choosing to plant good seeds today. Free people, they know that their now affects their later. So that's what I want to challenge you with this question maybe to think about this week. So what are the seeds that you're planting that you know you're going to harvest later? If they're good seeds, man, start planting more of those. If they're not good seeds, what is it going to take to get rid of that seed packet and maybe plant some good seeds in the same place? What are the seeds that you're planting today? Let's pray. Jesus, I pray that you would help every single one of us take inventory of the seeds that we are planting in our lives today, every action, every word, every thought, every response, whether said or unsaid. God, I pray that you would help us to get rid of the bad seeds and start planting the good seeds. Lord, help us to live and sow to the Spirit, to continually surrender to the Holy Spirit's leading in our lives. Jesus, I pray that as you illuminate the path before us, keeping us away from those negative consequences with all of the warning labels that you've given us in Scripture, I pray that you would help us to be courageous and brave enough to walk the path that you've set before us. To to resist the allure, the temptation of sin that only pleases for a season. I pray that you would help us to have the strength to resist that so that we can experience a harvest of righteousness, a harvest of life. Help us to plant good seeds today. We thank you for your grace that enables us to do that. Amen. We're going to head to our small groups, but I just want you to again think about that. Like, what are the seeds that you're planting? Small group leaders, your sheets are on the back. You guys are dismissed.